Oh, didn't mean to, but here we are. Okay. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How about you?
I'm hanging in here. I'm doing comms for a friend of mine in the legislature. I said I'll try it. I don't know if I can do this. It's a whole lot. It's a whole lot. And ooh, it's a lot. But you are here and other people will join. But I really wanted to get your perspective for so many reasons. So we'll get right to it in about 30, 20 seconds. That is. Okay. Let me do this. Okay. He didn't get that. Okay. He said he didn't get this link. Okay. Just one moment. It's really awful. Robert Walker, thanks so much for the work that you are doing to try all of this happen. Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to begin with you. And let's get right to it. Someone said they didn't, everybody else got their link, but okay. All right. We're up there, everybody. Hey, 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 hey. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you on this cold day. Oh, my gosh, it's cold. I hope you're warm wherever you are. Hey, shalom, Robert. Hello, Andre. For all of you who are not on the chat line, hey, 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 sending you so much love today. Praying for hey, Josette, sending all of our brothers and sisters in California, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, so much love. Because a lot of our people are in need of rescue all over the country. Let us not forget about the storms that hit North Carolina and South Carolina and Tennessee. There are people who are freezing in the mountains in tents provided by our government. In mobile homes, many of these homes do not have heat. We've got to figure out what to do about them. Things need to be made right for them right now. Think about that. So there are a lot of people who are in need. But let's look at California, everybody. These firefighters, they are on the front lines. And we pray that their lives will be spared. Having said all of that, uh, we've got to look at something else. About half of the firefighters, nearly half, close to half, are prison laborers who make $5.80 a day to $10.24 a day. $10.24, that is, with $1 added for being in an active emergency. Is that right? I want to know what your thoughts are, Josette and Andre and Will and Robert and everyone else who's checking us out. Please like and share, like and share, like and share, like and share. And I need you to put those thumbs up. You help us in the algorithm when you do that. $5.80 a day. And get this. Once they are released from prison with all of this experience, because they are used routinely to fight the wildfires, they're not allowed to be a part of the fire departments because of their records. So they have all of these skills that they cannot put to use in a job that pays about $100,000 a year or more in the real world. Yeah. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? Let me know in the chat. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's a horrifying thing. Please go to the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page and meet me on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, everybody. Meet me on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. And I'm on Blue Sky. santitajackson.bsky.social. And I want to see where you are and what your thinking is. And so let's talk about that. I want to start with you, Attorney Mark Fancher, because the ACLU is beginning to get involved. Other human and civil rights organizations, civil liberties organizations are getting involved. And maybe because of the scale of this disaster in California, people are talking about it a little bit more, but I don't think we're talking about it enough, Mark. I mean, when people hear $5.80 a day, that just, this is unbelievable. How can this happen in 2025?
Well, it can happen in 2025 because it happened in 1825 and 1925, 1935, on up to today. The idea of using prisoners as laborers is a well-established U.S. tradition. It's as American as apple pie. Because the fact is that at the time that chattel slavery was abolished in this country in 1865, the need for agricultural labor on the plantations in the South did not suddenly vanish. They still needed people to work that land. And one of the methods that they used to continue to force Black people in particular to perform this labor is what came to be known as the convict lease system. And the way that that worked is that sheriffs and constables in the South would go out and they would arrest wholesale large numbers of Black people on spurious charges. They would fill their jails with these people, and then they would rent their labor out to the plantation owners. And there was an economic incentive to do that. The more people that they arrested, the more people that they would have to rent out. So that certainly was something that we've come to know. And in fact, it was so important to preserve this method of forcing people to labor that if you look at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which presumably abolishes slavery, it carves out an exception and says that prisoners can still be compelled to labor without pay. You move on up through the years, you have chain gangs where prisoners are forced to labor. You had labor camps where the conditions in these camps were so horrific. I mean, it's nightmarish kinds of places where they would put Black men, for the most part, sometimes convicted of crimes and sometimes just presumably there as independent workers, but they would cram them, into these little shacks that were, just as though they were sardines. They were unsanitary. It was filthy. They had no opportunities for any type of, hygiene or anything, and they were forced to labor. And there were, abuses that took place in these labor camps, sexual and otherwise. And it was just really horrific. And you continue, I mean, it's always been sort of a fact of life that in this country that you use prisoners for purposes of labor. And as you alluded to, it's not that this is rehabilitative, because in the case of firefighters, the experience that they're having is that they're not able to gain employment as firefighters after they're released because of the stigma attached to their criminal records. And, it's not just firefighters. Richard Pryor had the old gag where he talked about, how prisoners they've been trained to make license plates. He says, "Where am I going to get a job making license plates?"
That's
So
true.
it's not a question of trying to rehabilitate them. It's just a question of exploiting people who find themselves behind bars, and it raises questions that are more fundamental about the whole idea of incarcerating people in the first place.
Well, what questions are raised? Because this is something that legacy media, the corporate media, they're not discussing that just roughly half of the firefighting force, they are prisoners, Mark Fancher. And they certainly have not delved uh, into the reality that these now highly skilled workers who are working alongside people who have six-figure incomes cannot come out of prison, which is supposed to rehabilitate you, and get jobs doing this. These are great jobs, and California has wildfires all the time. Clearly, if they have to double their workforce in order to combat these wildfires, and they use them routinely, clearly they need more firefighters. I mean, am I following my line of logic, or am I?
Yeah, but see, that's the problem. That's why you're not a good American, is that you think logically. And in this country, logic is not something to be not you're not supposed to think that way. Because when you start thinking logically, then you start costing money. You start taking money away from people who are trying to amass as much profit as they possibly can. And what happens when you start truly training people and you start employing them at market rate wages? Then your labor cost goes up, and that cuts into your bottom line, cuts into your profits. And so the whole idea of having these people who are disposable people, second class people, warehousing them so that they can be strategically used at any given time in order to provide the labor that they don't want to pay for, is completely in the spirit of slavery as an institution, because that's what that was all about. It was about forcing people to do work and not having to pay them, so that greedy people who purportedly owned them would be able to make larger profits. And that's not something that's gone away. And in fact, it's not just a question of using their labor. I mean, prisons have become a major profit-making industry, over the years. And there are private prison corporations and other companies that benefit from having this phenomenon of prisons and mass incarceration. Lots of money to be made. And when you start talking in ways that suggest that maybe we should do things a different way, then you're starting to tamper with people's money, and they don't take too kindly to that.
I mean, it just all seems so insane. I mean, before Mike Elk joins us he's a senior labor reporter for Payday Report. I'm just, are there rights being violated? I mean, do you have any rights as a prisoner at all, Mark Fancher?
You do have rights, but not in the context of what we're talking about in terms of the exploitation of your labor. There are conditions of confinement that must be maintained at appropriate levels, and certainly there are other civil rights violations that could presumably be committed against prisoners, and they have rights not to be beaten or deprived of um, of medical treatment, or to be deprived of their opportunities to practice religion and things like that. But those are things that don't really cost any money. In fact, they kind of save money, because then when you prohibit prison personnel from abusing prisoners, then they can't sue, and or they don't have grounds to sue, and then they don't have to pay out huge settlements and judgments. So those kind of rights they're glad to protect. But rights to make decent wages for work that you do, nah, that's not with the program, and we really can't get behind it. And I think, unfortunately, there's mass ignorance in the public about what's going on here. For most people who just give passing thought to the idea of putting prisoners out there to fight the fires, many of them probably think, well, that's a good thing. I mean, these are criminals and worthless people who are not otherwise contributing to the society. At least have them engaged in something that's helpful to the society, have them go out there and put out fires. I mean, they deserve not to be paid because they're criminals, quote unquote. But the fact is that the overwhelming majority of people who are in prisons really don't have to be there. When we think of prisoners generally, we think of these psychotic mad dog killers, ferocious, horrible rapists, and these kinds of people. They do exist, but they represent a very small minority of the prison population. The majority of people in prisons are people who are there because of things like drug offenses and property crimes and other things. They're not really dangerous people. And given half a chance, most of them would be able to rehabilitate themselves and to become very productive members of society. But this is a society that does not want them to become rehabilitated. It needs them to go into these prisons, and that's where they end up.
Let me bring up Mike Elk, senior labor reporter for the paydayreport.com. How you doing, Mike?
Good, yourself?
Oh, doing well. This is attorney Mark Fancher, brilliant, brilliant attorney in the area of civil liberties, civil rights, racial justice. And as you can hear, many people are really surprised that prisoners are fighting these fires in California. And when they hear what they're being paid, they're shocked. Now, some people are saying, Attorney Fancher and Mike Elk, well, they're in prison, but that kind of seems like not fair. I was just talking to someone about this. I was like, kind of seems not fair. $5.80 a day, $5.80 a day. Let me let me clarify. $10.24 a day with $1 for being in an active emergency, while the wealthy are hiring people for $2,000 a day to privately protect their properties. I don't get it. Help me to understand what we're looking at.
Well, what you're dealing with here is this is really a result of austerity, as well as a combination of austerity, the criminal justice system, and racism. And many different parties are negatively affected by this. You used to have, during the FDR New Deal, you had groups, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that would go out and clear brush, right? And this was a job that was prepared, just not a job that you do once a year, but that you do year round, right? And these were good jobs that were designed to help struggling people and struggling economies. What you have now is you have such a big rush to cut taxes, particularly in California, with the various propositions there, that there's not that same budget anymore. So people start looking for other ways to save money. And the one way they look for is prison labor, right? It's high risk work. You don't have to train people particularly well. If they get hurt on the job, they don't necessarily have the same rights or the same ability to access their rights as if they were municipal employees or state employees who were protected by union contracts. This is all non-union labor here, and it's extremely dangerous work. And so you have this system of prison labor, and it's just not that you have prison labor coming in during fires. My colleague Bob Sloan, the late Bob Sloan, rest his soul, and I did a series of investigations for The Nation about a decade ago. These prison laborers have started to create loopholes so that they're making office furniture, so that they're making other things. And groups like ALEC have come in and figured out loopholes. So the idea, take for instance, the movie Dunkirk, which won a bunch of awards a few years ago. I liked the movie, the Christopher Nolan movie. I read the book. I got to about page 210, and they revealed that they used prison labor in France to build the sets, right? Mm-hmm. So when you create a pool of captive labor that isn't being paid a minimum wage, it's just not putting those workers at risk that are incarcerated, that have less risk, that don't have access to unions, but it's jeopardizing union workers. This should be, if you're out there clearing brush, you should be making $25, $30 an hour. That's what people in the National Park Service make when they do that kind of work, which is very low considering the amount of training you have. So it's really a problem where you have, problems of the criminal justice system and austerity combining.
Well, We're talking with Mike Elk, Payday Report, senior labor reporter, and attorney Mark Fancher. You know, uh, one of my viewers, Salam Allah alternate channel, who he says, who set these low rates of pay in the first place? Does anyone have any idea? Who sets the rates?
These rates are typically set by the state. And sometimes when they're working on what they would call private outside contracts, they have to pay people the prevailing wage. However, they can subtract the cost of incarcerating and feeding them, which they're doing anyways. So, you know, it undercuts workers. I mean, these are jobs that, you know, if here you're talking about guys in prison that are young, if these guys can be trained in 6 months to a year to do this kind of work, it's an entry level job for all kind of youth. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't have an issue with youth that are underemployed and unemployed and disadvantaged getting work. I have an issue with the conditions of it.
Well, what's concerning to me also is that, in the civilian world, for people who are not in prison, there's always this fight, Attorney Fancher. I want you to jump into Mike Elk, for Black people in particular and the Latino community to get these jobs, to get in line for these jobs. But we're always told that we can't pass the test. Our test scores are not as high, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, in an emergency, they pull these people who supposedly can't pass the test, they put them in a uniform, and they have them doing the work. I mean, Mark, that resonated with you. Why?
Yeah, I mean, because it's just a very graphic example of how labor opportunities are controlled and managed for the advantage of some. There was a seminal civil rights case that was decided a few years ago that involved firefighters, and the claim that was made by the Black and Latino firefighters is that they were, of course, not scoring as high on the exams because they lacked the institutional history that white firefighters had. I mean, there were many aspects to this case, but this was one aspect of it, and that is that the white firefighters were frequently members of the latest generation in their families to be firefighters. And when it came time to take the test, that dad and granddad were able to help tutor them. They managed to, use their connections to get access to the materials and the study materials, and sometimes the tests themselves in advance. And they went into the test better prepared just because of these institutional factors. Whereas the Black and Latino firefighters, first generation, they come in and they don't do as well on the test because they weren't helped. Nobody helped them to cheat. And this type of employment is one that's highly valued, and so that those who are in inner circles will try and make sure that they preserve these employment opportunities for selected people, for people who really they want to be in it. And I'll tell you, it's widespread. I actually represented police officers in an employment discrimination case years ago, and we were challenging the test. And one of the test preparation companies that was catering primarily to white police officers, I was in my office one Sunday afternoon and I got a call. And so the guy on the other end said, "Hey, I'm with whatever the name of the company is, the testing company." And I thought, as harder working lawyer as you are, you'd be in the office on a Sunday. And so I just wanted to, just check in with you. I know as part of the case, you get access to a lot of materials. And so, if by chance, as part of discovery, they turn over some of the older tests to you, why don't you run them by me? Let me take a look at them, just to sort of advise you on the tests. I mean, so they stop at nothing to get access, and then they use it. That kind of thing, I'm sure, goes on all of the time, and so they're certainly not going to open up opportunities for employment to people who have traditionally been locked out and marginalized.
Mike Elk, are unions concerned about this? Are
I
they
think,
speaking to
yeah.
this at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unions that are concerned about this kind of work because this is work that would traditionally be done by union employees. So there has been a number of unions that have spoken out about prison labor. It's not at the top of the list, particularly with the Trump administration coming in, but it is an area where we've seen numerous unions speak out. You've seen some more non-traditional unions like the IWW organize prison labor strikes in places like Alabama and elsewhere. So it's not at the top of the radar, and I think it's a real issue, and I think it's an issue in many ways when you consider the racial inequalities in the criminal justice system reflects some of the issues that I think the labor movement has in terms of embracing, fully racial justice issues in some ways. The labor movement does in many ways embrace these issues, but this hasn't been at the top of most people's radar.
Do you think because it's not being discussed at this time?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some discussion now with LA fires because this is probably one of the most high profile wildfires ever. So we're seeing a lot of discussion, and it's been interesting. At least online, we're seeing a lot of discussion. We can all get into our own little silos, particularly as people in the movement. It's easy to get into silos and think everybody's talking about it, but we're starting to.
I'm talking about it in my silo. But when I turn on TV and when I really tune into the radio, Mark, they mentioned it on Black-oriented radio here in Chicago. And so I heard a couple of cab drivers talking about it today, thankfully. But they're not exploring this. I mean, I just saw before we came on the air, they were talking to a realtor in Pacific Palisades, which is a very wealthy community. And I don't care if you're rich or poor. If all of your tangible valuables and tangible memories have been burned to the ground, it's traumatizing. And so my heart goes out to everybody. So I'm not gonna do that. But to not discuss what to me is clearly a human rights abuse, I think it's negligent, because they continue to go back to the wealthy people and they give you Altadena, which is, a Black community, middle class and working class. Okay, and I'm glad that they're doing that, but they're not mentioning this. And to me, this is a real issue too. And they fight these wildfires all the time. But because this is one of the worst disasters we have seen ever of this type, 580 a day, Mike? I mean, I would think all the union leaders should be on TV, or they ought to be raising up a fuss in their silos so loudly that it begins to bleed out here so the people can talk about it.
Yeah, I think, in some ways, you talk about the silos here, and labor is certainly in a silo. Last week, and I'm certainly frustrated about this, you look at the Laken-Riley Act, the anti-immigrant Laken-Riley Act, which would allow the federal government or state government, state attorney generals, to deport anyone who's been arrested, not charged or convicted of a crime, arrested, right? So, I mean, we saw how that worked out during Jim Crow, where, you pick up some day laborers at a Home Depot and you throw them in jail, and, you throw them across the border. And we saw Democrats overwhelmingly support that, including several, like John Fetterman, who got a lot of labor backing. And I think, you're looking at some of these unions like the Teamsters or the Longshoremen, and, they're hoping to cut deals with the Trump administration on labor. I mean, Trump is playing a very sophisticated game in trying to do a divide and conquer strategy with labor. He appointed a congresswoman from Oregon, as Secretary of Labor, who was in a very vulnerable Democrat-heavy seat, who was a one-term congresswoman whose father was a Teamster and I guess had backed some symbolic measures. And so right now you're seeing labor, which by 2030 will be majority people of color, but it's still 75% white male leaders. You're seeing labor, see if they can play ball with Trump, see if maybe Trump will throw them a few bones. And I think, that's a lesson for disaster, because we're in a fight against fascists that, we're going to have to mobilize all our resources. We're going to have to connect movements, and we're going to have to take on some very powerful people. And you can't do that unless you find the intersections of solidarity between people. So I think it's a real issue that union leaders aren't up screaming bloody murder as much on the incarcerated firefighters. And they're not also at the same time saying anything about, for the most part, not saying anything about the anti-immigrant Bacon Act.
Well, I mean, they are not talking about that at all, and it's that aspect, that little tidbit, Mark. No one's talking about it. Because they're what's being juiced up. Because quite frankly, this is the American way. We've been doing this for a minute. Well, you just pluck people, and we arrest them and we deport them. We do what we will. That's what we've been doing. I mean, Mark, it's the quiet part to me is being said out loud. This is, as you said at the top before you got here, Mike. You said, look, the 13th Amendment, prison labor. This is not new. You got a captive audience. But I mean, this is all part of the continuum, Mark. This is to me is very dangerous. And what's very dangerous to me, Mark and Mike, first you, Mark, and then you, Mike, is for us not to have the discussion. The lack of acknowledgement is what is so stunning to me.
Yeah, I mean, and the reason that we don't have the discussion is because, just to put it bluntly, this country is spiritually dead. And it was brought home to me earlier today. I was talking to an Arab American who said, you look at the devastation in Los Angeles, and you see the vast, destruction. And he said, that looks just like Gaza. He says, but the difference is the people in California, most of them still are alive and they have their families with them. Imagine that same type of devastation, and you've lost your children, you've lost your elders, you've lost everything that's dear to you and everyone who's dear to you. And then what do you think? And we're in a country that can't recognize, that can't make those comparisons, because our country's tradition is to other people. We can only relate to those who look white, who live white, who are part of a favored caste or group. Otherwise, we can't relate to them, and so we can't relate to these Black and brown prisoners. I mean, they're others. I mean, and so yeah, so what? They're out there working for pennies a day, fighting fires and putting their lives at risk. They should be thankful that they're being engaged in productive work, and we're giving them $5.80 a day. What more do they want? I mean, we could just kill them all, just like we kill all of the brown people over in Gaza. And so when you've got a country that's on that level, where they can't even recognize the basic humanity of their fellow human beings, then you've got a country that's in some serious spiritual trouble. And it's particularly ironic because this is something that Jesus himself specifically called out even during his time in first century Palestine, where he cautioned that those who will be favored are those who will come and visit the prisoners. And he himself said that he had come to set the prisoners free. So for the U.S. to treat prisoners in the way that they're treating them, that's very telling about where we are.
It is very telling. I mean, Mike, I think this does speak to who we are. We keep hearing, our elected officials say, as they rail on about Donald Trump, this is not who we are. I'm like, yeah, this is who we are, Mike. It is.
Yeah. I mean, It's I live here in Western Pennsylvania, here in Pittsburgh, which was strangely one of the few areas where we did slightly better, for lots of reasons. There was a lot of party reforms, just a lot of different reasons. But it is who we are, and as someone who spends a lot of time, overseas in Brazil and other places, it's embarrassing to see us lose that moral leadership that we have. Particularly, when you're in Brazil or you're in places like that, there's such a reverence for African American culture, for the civil rights movement, because they went through the dictatorship. And, we have been leaders in this country. We have, fought the Nazis or fought Jim Crow, but we've always had this reactionary element in this country. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about silos, is that we are talking in silos. I read a study that, people are hanging out half as much as they did a decade ago, right? People aren't going to the corner bar anymore, or going to the bowling league or the Elks Club or whatever and engaging in folks. Instead, you're getting these narratives that are fed to people. And we see, Trumpies all around here. I mean, I live, I have two Trumpies that live across the hall from me. And I live in a building where I'm the only white guy in the building, which is ironic. But that's what I mean, is that people are getting into such silos that they're believing what they want to believe.
But when you've got, the Democrats and the Republicans have flipped. Republicans are saying, we don't want any more, for whatever reasons. Let's get out of these wars, and let's question the alphabet companies. CIA, FBI. Democrats are all in now. It's bizarre. And then you've got Steve Bannon. Did you hear what he said the other day? He called out Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and another gentleman who's with them. He said, how can Elon Musk have this kind of power? I'm paraphrasing him. He said, because he is so racist. He said, he's a white South African. How can we tolerate him here? He's so racist. This is evil. This is what Steve Bannon is saying. I've not heard a Democrat say that. No one has talked about the fact that these people, you got the right wing so-called, Peter Thiel was raised in Namibia, which is South Africa adjacent. The southern, it wasn't just South Africa, it was Southern Africa. It was Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And no one's talking about that. And in the same breath, no one is talking about, the dehumanization of these people. And it's men and women who are doing this. The only difference between they put the prisoners in orange suits. And to me that speaks to while everybody's nervous about Trump. I'm like, wait a minute, I hear you all. I got you. But as a descendant of slaves, of enslaved people, I can't get but so chopped up about any of it, because I'm like, okay, I've taken it all. We have lived through everything here. And now, even after the Civil War, even after we have been freed from slavery, I've got slaves who are sitting up here battling the fires, because this is slavery by another name, Mike and Mark. That's what this is. And no one will call this out. I need the union leadership to stand 10 toes down and be at the top of a mountain, no pun intended, shouting that this is wrong. Or if you're going to use them, pay them. Somebody's got some money. Ukraine keeps getting money. Biden is doing his best to make it rain on all these countries that Americans don't want anyone to send any more money to. Help me. You got to help me. I always get people smarter than me on this show, because you all know something that I don't know. But please, you're in Pennsylvania, and President Biden pardoned what the cash for kids judges.
Right before I came on the program, I saw a press release from the White House press list that Biden had just inaugurated an aircraft carrier called the USS George W. Bush.
Really?
put out a statement about it. Just, I don't know if they're going to put the mission accomplished banner they had in Iraq at the top, as a memorial or something. But I just thought, here I'm sitting the last week in office. Here's Joe Biden naming an aircraft carrier after George W. Bush. I mean, there's a lot going on in that image right there.
But does that really surprise you though?
No.
I mean, just because his record, he's did some good things as president, no question. But his record, he's always been from the right of the party. His politics have always been very. I mean, thank you. We got Clarence Thomas because of him. He buried Anita Hill. Remember his apologizing to her, Mark, as you recall, was a big issue when he was running for president in 2020. And at first, she would not accept his apology. Maybe she got the call. I don't know. She said, "Look, whatever, let him run. But please, I don't want to talk about it anymore." So that's awful. And so, I mean, what are we to say here? Because what does it say about us internationally? What does it say to people? You've been in Brazil. I've been in Brazil. I've worked down there. And people, it's amazing the things that we get beat up over here in the United States are the things that people admire the most about us all across the world. The civil rights movement. I mean, people don't even, the Statue of Liberty was not to honor Europeans who were coming here. It was France's gift to us to honor us for ending slavery. The Statue of Liberty is a Black woman. What's so hard about this? And so, I mean, I need you to help me to understand what we are looking at. What does this say about us, Mike? Labor in this country. What does this say about labor in this country?
I think we really lost not just media literacy and media engagement and community engagement, but also civic education. We're not teaching, with all the testing going on at schools, we're not teaching young people the same kind of history. And, as much as this country's screwed up, I do like to think in some ways I'm proud to be American. I mean, both my grandparents were Jewish communists who volunteered to fight in World War II against fascists. And, there are legacies of this country that I'm quite proud of. But I tell you, it's really hard when you go to places like Brazil, when you're overseas and you have to defend the record. And I think we as social movements have to ask ourselves deep questions about how do we rebuild media? How do we create new connections between movements? How do we create more community engagement? And how do we create more community-oriented education? Because these problems aren't going to, there's no, in organizing, there's the famous saying, there's no shortcut. Mm-hmm. And there's no shortcut here. There's no panacea, we're going to fire up a TikTok account and, get it out there. It's really long, slow work. And we really have to see that engagement that, has been lacking. And I think the more we get into the social media age, particularly as journalists, I look at it a lot. It's quite scary. I mean, if you look at the number of people who read the daily newspaper compared to 20 years ago, we were looking at 50, 60% of the population reading the daily newspaper. And now we're looking at 20, 25%.
But do you know what my Chicago Sun-Times looks like now? It looks like a pamphlet. I mean, they fired the writers. Yeah. I mean, and when you look at the news, you have media, you have stars. You don't have anyone they investigate people who want to help people. But they let the oligarchs go. They let the people who engage in mass murder, they let them go. I mean, and now Americans have tuned out because they don't believe them, and they shouldn't. That's when I worry about the common good. I mean, what is this moment saying about us, Mark Fancher?
Well, it's not just this moment. I think it's quite a bit of time throughout the country's history, and we as people have been misdirected. We have aspired on one level or another to become part of the elite that has always control this country. The country was set up by an elite for the benefit of an elite and for purposes of exploiting and oppressing everybody else. That's the way it's been from the beginning. And when there have been efforts by those who are part of the broad masses of people to try and confront, challenge the elite, then inevitably they get romanced and tantalized into trying to become part of the elite themselves. I think that's what happened with organized labor. When you had the IWW and you had one big union and you had, cross-racial organizing and we're all brothers and fighting for workers, and somehow that evolved into something where you had, union bosses who were playing footsies with the corporate bosses and just trying to get a few crumbs and a few changes in working conditions and wages for their workers. I mean, they want to be part of the inner circle. I mean, that's where a lot of that comes from. And I think, unfortunately, even oppressed communities of color have aspired to white privilege. They want to be white too. And I think in many ways it accounts for why a significant number of people of color voted for Trump, because they felt like, this is my way of becoming white in the same way that the Irish became white, the same way that the Poles became white, the same way that the Italians became white. I can be a black for Trump, and now I can have white privilege too. And what they all miss is what the rest of the world is very attuned to, and that is that the heroic people in our country are the ones who are fighting against privilege and elitism and oligarchies and injustice and all of those things. The heroes in the eyes of the rest of the world are those who are civil rights activists. The heroes are the revolutionaries. The heroes are the people who stood up for equal justice, for women and those who stopped wars and those kinds of things. Those are the heroes, but those are not the heroes in this country. Those are people who are regarded as crazy people, marginalized people who are lunatics. And ideally, these are people who should be in prisons and wearing those orange jumpsuits, and maybe we can get them out there to fight some fires. We're all confused. The rest of the world is not confused, but we in this country are totally confused.
Totally confused. I mean, and we don't love these freedom fighters, Mike, until they are in repose, permanent repose, at least earthly repose. And
well, you bring up the rest of the world, right? You look at Merrick Garland and how he fumbled the prosecution of Trump for a year and a half there. And then, bring back up Brazil again. They tried a coup there. Everyone's indicted and going to jail, including Bolsonaro. His VP is already arrested. Bolsonaro's indicted. The head of the party is indicted. All their top aides are indicted. We didn't do that here. We wanted to play nice with these guys. And I don't think they're going to play nice with us now that they're going to be in charge of DOJ and FBI and those things.
Well, I don't even know if they don't want to play nice with us, as they're all in it. That's one of the things that we're seeing. I mean, these people, both the major parties are two wings of the same plane. They just have different cultural appeals. Nothing changes. And I think that's why the plurality of Americans and the numbers are growing. They're independent. Look at what happened with Senator Fetterman. He wears the hoodie, wears the shorts. He postures himself, as someone who you think might be a progressive. I always kind of looked at him like, I don't know, because I'm listening to he's not progressive on some things that matter to me. He doesn't have a balanced policy in the Middle East. He cozies up a little bit too much to the right wing. I mean, I understand, getting along with people because you gotta get past legislation with everybody, but there was always something that wasn't quite right, and now we're seeing it play out. Right?
I covered Fetterman for 13 years. I grew up
in
Braddock, and he was always this guy. I mean, he was always this guy, and this was a big issue. Is that I also went to high school with Congresswoman Summer Lee. He never once had Summers back in any of these races that she ran. When she was running for state rep, and actually, organized labor spent something like in a state reps race, like $250,000 against her, and she still won by 72%.
Really?
She was an incumbent. She was the only incumbent state representative in Pennsylvania that the AFL-CIO did not endorse. The only one, because she spoke up about the issues related to the pollution from U.S. Steel, which is represented by the steelworkers, who, by the way, all those guys down there who were steelworkers went around and endorsed Trump. So, Fetterman has always been this guy who will say whatever he thinks is going to get him in front of a microphone. He's been that guy for 13, 14 years. I think it's that we're getting in such a media hype stage that people aren't paying attention. They're not doing the homework anymore on these people. They're not getting serious coverage. I mean, thank God it did get coverage of how Fetterman pulled a gun on an unarmed black guy.
I missed that part. What happened now?
Well, this got some coverage in the New York Times, but it was like a decade ago. Fetterman heard some firecrackers or some gunshots. They never found any residue of gunshots. And what wound up happening is that he saw a black guy jogging with a hoodie on and, pulled a shotgun on him.
A shotgun.
I never really apologized for it.
How? Oh, wow. How
so what I'm saying is that anybody who had been following Fetterman for 10, 15 years, the writing was always on the wall. I mean, he does this whole cosplay that he's a working class guy when he's a trust fund kid. I mean, his parents own a big insurance company. He went to Harvard. He's not even from Pittsburgh. He's from about 5 hours away on the other side of the state. And he got sent here in AmeriCorps. And Braddock is a little municipality of about 2,000 people right on the edge of Pittsburgh. And he got elected there, I think, with a total of like 270 votes total as mayor because he was a trust fund kid. So he could work full time and go, help put up the swing at the playground and, do that kind of stuff that a cash-starved municipality that can't afford a full-time mayor would. But it was always very clear covering him early on that, with his trust fund and his Harvard connections, that he wasn't really interested in helping build capacity of the local nonprofits, but in creating his own. And if you weren't with his program, you were out of there. So he's always been this guy. And now look, his wife, Giselle Fetterman, was an undocumented Brazilian immigrant. Her mother came here as a grad student and stayed. Now he's selling out those folks. It just doesn't seem like, from having been around him for years, it doesn't, it's just someone who is very opportunistic. He was a Bernie guy when that was popular, and now he's going to be a Vichy Democrat now that that's popular. Vichy as a reference to the Vichy collaborationist with the Nazis, right?
Kind of
and the Vichy argument was that if you play ball with these guys, maybe you can mitigate some of the worst, which is what Fetterman's doing. But then, last week we had this Lakin-Riley Act, this anti-immigrant act, right? Mm-hmm. And it got 48 congressional Democrats in the House, which is bad. It's bad, but there was some hope you could filibuster in the Senate. But once Fetterman broke it, the logjam, everybody else followed. There was a real opportunity there to filibuster it. Maybe you lose a couple Democrats, but when someone like Fetterman, who's not up for re-election for 4 years, who is somewhat popular here in Pennsylvania because of his public persona, he's dresses in these shorts and the hoodie and all this. It'll be snowing. This bridge collapsed here. It'll be snowing. He'll be out on the bridge in the snow and the hoodie and shorts. And, he does all this stuff. And he's always talking about, which fast food chain he likes better, Sheetz or Wawa. And, he does this stuff that lacks any substance. I think 30, 40 years ago, the media was pretty screwed up 30, 40 years ago. I think he would have had a much harder time selling this brand.
But he's been protected.
Yeah.
He's been protected, and that's what's interesting. Because Summer Lee has had no cover.
Yeah, and she's actually from Braddock, which is the real awful part of it. That here she is, an incumbent state rep, and nearly every incumbent Democrat in Allegheny County was rallying around her, except Fetterman, who's the senator. And so that's always, in my opinion, been who he is. And, if you look at even the way he's taken on this Gaza stuff, getting up in people's faces, mocking people. There was a protest. It's a strange story. Fetterman bought this old car dealership that had two floors, and they had some crazy government boondoggle where he thought, we'll bring in a Michelin star restaurant into a very poor black neighborhood, and it will just change the neighborhood. It was totally crazy. And meanwhile, it was right the first floor of the property he owns, right? Which everyone thought was super shady. That, in the restaurant, I mean, my dad was a union rep. I mean, they're fairly middle class. They couldn't afford to eat there. The glass of wine was like $13. So, if my folks can't afford to eat there and they're pretty middle class and we live 2 miles away, nobody in that neighborhood, which is much poorer, could. So, he's always had this. And I just think we're in such an age of celebrity and instant gratification and clicks that,
This is unbelievable. Maria Rodriguez says, "Hey, Maria, I have missed you, girl. Where are you?" I guess Fetterman is a chameleon. I guess so. And I guess the media have snookered us once again. And it's interesting who they decide to protect and the stories that they decide to project and the stories that they keep hidden. And I think that just brings us back to front, Mike Elk, because that's one of the reasons I have such admiration for your work, because you bring out the stories that we really need to be talking about. I mean, really need to be talking about labor. Really, really. And this to me is a labor issue.
Yeah.
I think that's why I'm like $5.80 a day, $10.24 a day, $10.24. Let me put it that way. $10.24 a day, tacking on an extra dollar because you're in an active emergency. I'm like, wait a minute. No. Well, why don't you close this out? What's your final word? What should we be looking at with this?
Well, I think we got to stay engaged in all of it. And I would tell people to go out and support independent media. People who want to subscribe to our newsletter, it's free. You can do so at paydayreport.com. We subsist almost entirely on reader donations. We get a little bit of grant money. But I would tell people to get engaged, to read, to forward. That's always very important. Forward stuff to other people and get them engaged. Because unless we have folks talking about this in a big way, it's so easy, particularly if you look at what Facebook is doing, what Twitter is doing, what these big apps are doing. I mean, our business took a hit. We had 20,000 subscribers on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
We switched over Blue Sky. We have about 1,000, and we crowdfunded. And we've watched how these social media barons are really pushing out the small publishers, and it's a big issue.
Oh, they really are. How can we reach you on Blue Sky?
Mike Elk at Blue Sky.
Okay, and how else can we reach you? I want everyone to know.
On Instagram, Mike Elk Reports. On Twitter, Mike Elk. And then we have a free newsletter, paydayreport.com. Folks can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter.
Absolutely.
Free, but we ask for voluntary donations if people can, but otherwise they can read it for free. If folks can't afford, we just ask them, hopefully share it if they can, if they can't afford to pay.
No, paydayreport.com. Go on and please, this is Mike Elk, everybody. He needs your support. He supports us. Let's support him. How about that card?
Thanks so much.
Sending you so much love. You got to come back on the show.
Thank you for having me. I definitely will. Thanks.
Always. Blessings to you. The
You too.
Santita Jackson Show. Sending you much love, everybody. The Santita Jackson Show, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. God bless. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks. Where'd you live in Brazil?
Oh, I worked there. So I was in and out of Brazil for several years in Sao Paulo, Rio, of course, but really Sao Paulo. That's where I was based.
Yeah. I went to college there 20 years ago.
Did you really?
Yeah, I did. I did 3 semesters there. I got into a weird program at Pitt when I was 17 and did a summer in